Good evening, this is Back Garden Reads, and today we are reviewing modern Japanese 25 short stories by Japan's leading writers, asterisk, edited by Ivan Morris, with a news forward by Seiji Lippert, translations by Ivan Morris, Edward Seiden Sticker, George Saito, and Jeffrey Sargent. Tuttle Publishing. As it says, there's 25 short stories in this book of 500 pages. There is a lot of illustrations throughout the book, about one illustration per story, so there's 25 illustrations overall. For instance, for downtown, you have this lady and in front of a kind of a shack, or this illustration of what looks to be a dog with hair, a cigarette, and a scarf, or at least a dog-headed man with a cigarette, hair, scarf, and reading a book. There's this one, or an illustration of two spearmen fighting each other. This is an illustration of one of the longer stories early on. Of one of the first stories is this lady's hand with I think it's a champagne or wine glass. The asterisk that I said earlier with the Japan's leading writers is that a lot of this, that's an asterisk for the reason that most of these writers are dead. They no longer exist. They are ex-authors. However, what they do mean is in the context that these writers ushered in the modern Japanese writing, in which you get I think it's Murakami or something, was probably influenced by quite a few of these writers, and you can kind of get that with a lot of these stories. And some of these stories are a bit more fantastical than others, not pure fantasy, more like magical realism. There are some that are historical fiction, and then there's some that are views on character and trying to understand characters. And it's that which really brings to life, and it's the variety in authors and stories that really brings a proper appreciation to Japanese story. And there's a bit of a lengthy introduction, which is about 30 pages long. Right before every story begins, there's usually a little bit of an introduction to the author of that short story. You usually might address the sort of education, their work background, when they started writing, their life, how they died, or other things that might very well be necessary to the nature of their work. Some of these introductions to the authors before these short stories are a bit longer than others. Some are really short, some are really long. When you account that in, if you want to skip over the author introduction, you could do that if you want. If you do read them, you do get a better appreciation for the work and the philosophy behind it, or the ideas of the work in general. There's this one story called A Man's Life. It's a story of this one gang member recounting the story of when he was in prison to this other guy. And it was this recounting of this man who knows he will die eventually, he just doesn't know when, and it's about the appreciation of a man's life, caring about respect and all these things. And you find that he's quite a horrible guy, or maybe he's not a horrible guy. He murdered someone and robbed people and all that, and it's really quite an unfortunate thing. And while you do kind of see the man as sort of a monster at first, and it is said that they extend the death sentence is prolonged, as in it's put back a year at least if they murder it within the cell again. And so at first you get this paranoia of the storyteller going oh god, is he just going to murder me? Oh, I don't want to be that. But then he eventually begins to understand and sympathize, or rather empathize, with the guy. And you see that most likely that this guy did it in a fit of passion, and then you could see the absolute inhuman dread of being oh fuck, am I gonna die today? And you get that tension of when he recounts for every morning of the tension between oh hey, is he gonna die am I gonna die today? Oh my god, And then, because it usually happens a little bit after breakfast, and you could see this dread, and it's like about this dread of this one guy, and then eventually it's this very humanist understanding of stories. And another story that that I read that was, it's pretty sad. It's sad in some ways, and in other ways it's just like, oh, what? The Hateful Age. And The Hateful Age is the story of this family that are absolutely sick and tired of looking after their near 80-year-old grandma that is just perceived causing, which from the perspective of the families that get involved, perceived to be a nuisance and malicious and everything like that. It does build up a sort of sympathy for the old woman throughout that short story, but at the same time, it also gives you this question of like, or is she actually being malicious? Is she like touched in the head? Does she have Alzheimer's or something like that? Is she just getting too on in years? Is she just all that? It gives this kind of back and forth, pulls you back and forth of like, oh, that is absolutely despicable for treating this old lady horribly and all this, and just blah blah blah. But then at the same time, you're just like, man, this old lady seems like, at times it does seem like she's doing this on purpose, and so it pulls at your sympathy and this tug of war of understanding. Like, is she doing this on purpose, or is she not doing, or is it just accidental, or everything, or it really gives you this idea that you're not entirely sure what the case is or what the story is fully, and it's really down in the end to your interpretation, though there is a strong inclination that faking it, which is a terrible thing to hear and say about this really, really old woman. But then when you're reading the story, it really does pull you back and forth. And then there's one of the longest stories is this historical on this one daimyo who's distantly related to a shogun, right? I think it's Tokugawa, distantly related to Tokugawa, but that's backdropping. And what it's about is just like this guy that is just like he's very confident in himself and he's all happy and everything like that. But then one day, after a spear fight, he overhears some of the spearmen that he fought against just saying like, yeah, oh man, aren't you just sick of always faking it and losing and throwing it to aggrandize the daimyo's prowess? And the daimyo overhears this, and then he gets into this depression, and he's completely unsure of his entire life, all the people around him. It begins off with this annoyance with the spearmen and the spearmen because of the age of like honoring the liege lords and their masters and all that. It sees the rage, and the spearman sacrifices himself, commits seppuku or harakiri, honors himself. Then throughout that short story, and there's like several sections to it, it's him gradually growing more and more and more depressive, and then going to like, is any of this actually real? Have I actually accomplished anything? Am I actually a good leader? Am I actually a good warrior? Am I actually smart? Am I actually a good game player? Am I actually good at anything? Is any of this real? Is the love of this woman that I'm with every night actually real? Is she only doing this because she's trying to respect my station? And then it goes through this whole depressive rut where he then becomes cruel and selfish and shit. And you see the consequences of that, and then ends with him being kicked out of his station, and he welcomes it, and he takes on this other name and everything. It examines the idea of like, if you are the son of this really important person, or this distantly, or even related to this really important person, and you're surrounded by so many people, like how many of them would be surrounded by yes men that would just always stroke their ego and pretend that they're always the best, and what would happen if that veil is ripped off, the wool is pulled out from over their eyes, and they finally realize that, oh, everything is shit. And at that realization, it's like the Truman Show, if you've watched that, of like this man, he doesn't know what's real or if any of his accomplishments are actually as accomplished. It's a story that really speaks, like whenever you see all these people in such high position of, like, you could say Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, these billionaires, all these world leaders or anything like that, how many of them have been surrounded, or like any sort of celebrity even? Like, how many of them have been so gassed up by all these hype men and hype women that really make them out to be so much greater than they actually are? How many of them are actually lied to, and like, how would they react? And you can kind of see that into modern day. That's generally a lot of what you can get out of these bunch of short stories. For that reason alone, I would say this book is totally worth it. If you can get this book, as if you just want to appreciate Japanese stories, or if you want to read more short stories from another culture, or you want to learn to write or get an appreciation for other perspectives, I think this is just definitely worth a read. Now, is it perfect? No, it might drag in some stories for you, and that's just the nature of the beast, because this is more of literary short stories rather than like genre short stories like science fiction or anything like that. But I would otherwise just recommend this for anyone. And that's my review.